Thank you.
Hello everyone. In behalf of the NBSAP Forum, I want to welcome you all to this session. I am Diego Ochoa, NBSAP Forum Communications Advisor. Thank you for attending our webinar series on using conservation planning to address biosafety and access to genetic resources. The third and last part of our webinar series is dedicated to ABS as an innovative financing mechanism. How to make it work? And it's presented by Dr. Balakrishna Pisupati from UNEP. This webinar will be focused on using ABS as an innovative financial mechanism at national level. Dr. Pisupati will provide some options for consideration by the parties to the protocol in defining access and benefit sharing provisions. Practical examples and suggestions will be provided. Dr. Pisupati has more than 25 years of experience working with biodiversity, law, policy, and development issues. At UNEP, he coordinates actions related to biodiversity, multilateral environmental agreements. He has previously held diverse positions, just like chairman of the National Biodiversity Authority of the Government of India, coordinator of Biodiplomacy Program at the United Nations University, and head of IUCN Asia Regional Biodiversity Program. Through his work on issues related to biodiversity planning, Dr. Pisupati has supported over 20 countries to develop and revise their NBSAP. More recently, he co-authored the interim assessment of post-2010 NBSAPs that was launched by UNEP, WCMC, and FNI in 2015. He's currently working to enhance cooperation among the biodiversity-related multilateral environmental agreements. Welcome, Dr. Bala, to this home for attending this invitation, and of course, it is a pleasure to have you here. As usual, before starting, I just want to remind you all some of the rules and our dynamics in the NBSAP Forum webinar series. Microphones will be mute during the presentation. This reduces interferences and facilitates the communications. We will have a 1-hour presentation followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers and some discussion around the topic. Please send us in advance your questions or raise your hand in the control panel of GoToWebinar platform. If you want to speak and the connection allows, we will open the participants' microphones to promote interaction during our Q&A sessions. As many of our participants are not English native speakers, me included, I would like to remind Dr. Bala the importance to talk slower. This fosters comprehension among our practitioners. As usual, this session is being recorded and it will be available at the NBSAP Forum website. All the participants will receive an email with a link to watch it, as well as a PDF copy of the presentation and a list of resources related to the topic. Now I will transfer webinar control to Dr. Bala. Thank you very much again for your participation, and please enjoy this session. Dr. Bala, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chrissy and Diego, for facilitating this webinar. I just want to confirm I'm audible and clear.
Yes, we are seeing the presentation and listening you clear.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Diego, and a warm welcome to all the attendees for this webinar. And in spite of exciting developments that are happening last night and today morning, I'm so happy to see several of you joining the webinar, not just glued to the Twitters and the Facebook and the LinkedIn messages. As Diego was saying, that this is the second presentation on access and benefit sharing as a part of this series currently. And before I start, let me mention that the ideas and the suggestions I'm making are based on my experience of working on ABS, both at the national level as well as at the international level for the last 20+ years. And for those of you who are familiar with access and benefit sharing and the Nagoya Protocol, many of you may be aware that currently we have more than about 40 countries that are in the process of developing national ABS frameworks. A large number of them are legislative frameworks, which means that once they are drafted, they'll be made into a law, an access and benefit sharing law in many countries. And as we are speaking, I'm reviewing at least 4 of such draft laws or decrees for countries in terms of ensuring their compliance with the provisions of the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. So this topic on financing may be a little new for you, but let me explain as and when I make a presentation. I'm going to give you some specific examples of how we can look at access and benefit sharing as an opportunity for raising finances for conservation and sustainable use. And a large part of it is not an academic interpretation of the provisions, but most of the examples or the experiences I'm going to give you are practical, where I've had a personal interaction or involvement in making some of these work at different levels. So with that introduction, let me first go to the next slide. Yes. So many of you are familiar with the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. It was adopted in 2010 as a part of the COP10 meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It entered into force in 2014, just about during the COP12 meeting in Pyeongchang. But to just give a quick overview of what the protocol is, that it actually provides what we call as legal certainty to both users of genetic resources as well as providers of genetic resources on how they can access those resources from different countries, communities, and areas, as well as laid down some procedures in terms of what is required minimally in terms of dealing with benefit sharing. So the protocol actually provides a kind of an operational framework for Article 15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity that is related to access and benefit sharing. And for those of you who follow the protocol negotiations would recognize that it's almost 20 years when we started, because access and benefit sharing is an element of the convention in itself, and the convention came into force in 1993. Whereas the protocol negotiations earnestly started in 2002 after the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development, where there was a call for having an international regime on benefit sharing. And that subsequently was passed on to the convention as a convention that focuses on access and benefit sharing to develop it further into an international regime. And subsequently, it took an iteration as a full-fledged legally binding protocol that was adopted in Nagoya in 2010. So essentially, we are talking of some experiences of implementation as well as many years of negotiations in terms of adoption. And as I mentioned before, dozens of countries are currently preparing the national implementation framework. But of course, the premise with which countries are working on this is that they want to have a framework that delivers what is expected in terms of the objectives of the protocol as well as objectives of the Convention on Biodiversity. And because it's a multilateral environmental agreement, it was negotiated at the international level. The implementation, after it is adopted and it had come into force, becomes a national responsibility. So which means that countries who are parties to the protocol have a responsibility of making it work at national level. And that is why a lot of innovations in terms of how to implement this framework, which many of you know, still is a very new concept for a lot of stakeholder groups and for a lot of countries to understand how to make it work at the national level. So the opportunity for being innovative in terms of the national level currently. And last and important, is positively used. So I've got 3 points just to give a bit of an overall understanding of ABS. One, from a conservation perspective. If you talk to people in the pharmaceutical industry, and this is published research, peer-reviewed research, where the indications are that species from tropical rainforests, if you lose one species, the quantum of loss of possible use for pharmaceutical industry is to the tune of approximately $200 million. So that is the value of resources, and that is the importance of conservation to deal with access and benefit sharing. We cannot work on access and benefit sharing independent of focusing and investing on conservation and sustainable management of our biodiversity. The second point is that still, in terms, even in having so many years of experience of negotiations and adoption of the protocol, there is still lack of clarity and transparency in national access and benefit sharing policies. And the result of it is the prospecting, which is value addition to those biological resources, turning them into commercial products, putting them in the market, making profits, and sharing the benefits, is still an uncertain action for a lot of industry. And lastly, and most importantly, the discussions that led up to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol focused mostly on administrative and legal issues than on access and benefit sharing to promote conservation and sustainable use. I'm not saying that there was no discussion. There was some discussion, but certainly a lot of importance and emphasis was on getting the administrative and legal issues correct, rather than focusing on conservation and sustainable use. Having said that, let me remind the participants on where does the financing part of these discussions come in. Many of you who follow the convention are aware that there has been a series of reports that were presented to the convention, to the conference of parties, on raising additional and innovative finances. And secondly, a full-fledged assessment based on country inputs on how much it will cost to achieve the current strategic plan for biodiversity, which is 2011 to 2020, and the Aichi biodiversity targets. And this report, which was one of the more recent reports, which was a high-level panel that was established by a decision of the COP, in 2012 presented a report that actually had put some numbers in terms of how much it would cost to achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets. Of course, our focus today is not on the Aichi targets per se, so I'm not going to get into the details of what the report said, but there are 3 or 4 points that are very relevant for us to be considered when we are discussing ABS as a financing option. First, the report said there are very clear differences in the relative scale of investments that are required to deliver various targets. And all of you would understand that's very obvious. Not all targets require the same kind of investment. There are targets that require less money, there are targets that require more money. And in addition, the investment needed to deliver the target is just not related to its importance alone. So which means because it's from a conservation or a sustainable use perspective, a target is very important. It doesn't mean that it requires much more resources to be achieved. So definitely that's a point to have in mind. The second one is very clearly, it says that the interlinkage or the codependence between the targets and the national policies are something that is going to be influencing the kind of investments that are needed. If a country has a very enabling policy environment that deals with biodiversity conservation, definitely the opportunities for the country to achieve the targets are better. So the codependence or the interlinkage between the target and the national policy here is just not the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, but also all the other related sectoral policies as well. But in preparing this report, there was a lot of emphasis or a lot of focus on traditional areas of resource mobilization in terms of raising resources. A lot of emphasis on payment for ecosystem services, a lot of discussion on debt swaps, debt for nature swaps, biodiversity offsets, and a lot of other suggestions were made. But for some reason, there's been limited focus in terms of using ABS as a financing mechanism. I'm not saying that it's a big drawback of the report, but this is one important area where the report could not or was not able to focus on when it finalized its recommendations. And the assessment of the financing part of implementing the actions at the national level for Aichi targets or the NBSAPs, almost all the COPs made decisions requesting parties and others to raise adequate, predictable, and sustainable financing. We are all familiar with so many decisions. Almost every COP comes up with a decision asking countries to do something more and something better. During COP 11 in 2012, countries agreed that they will develop a framework for financing by 2015, but only very few countries have done it. So which means that we actually currently do not have all the countries that have finalized their post-2010 NBSAPs that have a comprehensive financing strategy as a part of the revised NBSAP. And less than a third of the revised or updated post-2010 NBSAPs speak about strategies for financing. Not only having a financing strategy, but also speaking about it. It's been very weak. And the general tendency for countries is always to look out for financing, which is more an external aid. We have very few examples of NBSAPs that actually have seen countries suggesting what is the kind of internal financing that is available for conservation, and how is that they will be maximizing the effective use of such available resources within the country. And this point is important because the access and benefit sharing as a financing option relates more in terms of raising national finances, making countries use and approach ABS from a little different perspective. But also, if you're looking at the reports such as the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, the TEEB report, which all of you are familiar with, the report was launched in 2010. The report outlines options for recasting economic models for development using biodiversity and ecosystems. But after the report was presented, we have a large number of countries who actually are looking at a national TEEB report. How at national level they can look at ecosystems and biodiversity as a base for raising finances, as a base for economic incentivization of conservation and sustainable use. But we have very few examples of national TEEB actions where countries are working towards easing the way of making use of ABS systems. But what countries are doing is that certainly they are doing their best to make ABS systems more complex and limit the use of resources for economic benefits. There is an enormous emphasis on getting the legislative part absolutely correct, but very limited focus on how to make it work in the long run and how much will be the cost-benefit analysis of putting an institutional legal framework versus the kinds of benefits that will accrue because of implementing some of those frameworks. And this number is also useful just to have us to have it in mind. The estimates in 2012 indicate for Nagoya Protocol, which is a specific target under the Aichi targets. The estimate was that it requires anywhere from 7 to 30 millions per year until 2020 to effectively deal with Nagoya Protocol implementation. But sitting in 2016, many of us know that these numbers are absolutely possible to be raised. And I just want to give one example. There is one JEF project to help countries across different regions to implement the protocol, which alone is worth 12 million over a 3-year period. So here we are not looking at adequate finances to ensure the systems work, but how do we ensure that once the systems are put in place, that they will generate enough resources to make the entire activity more sustainable. So the current approaches in terms of access and benefit sharing provisions are having frameworks developed. A lot of countries are going towards having a very protectionist attitude in terms of the national frameworks. And the more you are going towards or tilting towards a protectionist attitude dealing with ABS, you actually are making it cost intensive, because the more you want to be protective of your biodiversity, the more cost you have to spend in terms of ensuring adequate compliance, enforcement, monitoring, and reporting mechanisms. And this is an important point to consider, is that how much of protection you need to ensure that people are encouraged to use the biodiversity, or are we talking of protectionist measures to stop people from using biodiversity? Because if you have a framework which is too protectionist, you actually are discouraging people from using your biodiversity or genetic resources. So the more you become difficult, the more or the less the chances for research and development, product development, and less will be the opportunity for benefit sharing. So in other words, the more the protectionist the ABS framework is, the less the opportunity for you to get benefits in the long run. Secondly, a lot of countries look at ABS as stopping people from misappropriating their biodiversity. by piracy, as it is popularly called. But very few countries are looking at ABS as a business model. And I'll give you one specific example of how it's going to work as a business model. Unless there is going to be a change in the mindset of those people who are negotiating the protocol, who are developing the frameworks, who are helping implement the framework, that the framework is to encourage people to use biodiversity genetic resources. And the more the people use it, the more the benefits that will accrue, the more the benefits it is going to go for conservation and sustainability. So it is very, very important for people to understand that let us not look for misappropriation only model, but let us make ABS into a business perspective for using genetic resources. The result of those two approaches globally is that we have seen very minimal, and for many countries, no revenues and non-monetary benefits that have accrued in the last 10 years of ABS implementation. Currently, there is no one consolidated figure that anybody can provide to say in the last 10 years or 4 years or 5 years since the implementation of Nagoya Protocol or ABS measures, what is the kind of benefits that have accrued across different countries in terms of an ABS fund. We don't have the numbers, but all of us are aware that it's very, very minimal. So in other words, we are embarking on developing frameworks at the national level, not certainly considering the cost-benefit analysis or an assessment of the need for having a framework and how the framework is going to be self-sustaining when it comes to implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. And it is at this point the discussions come in to find out whether access and benefit sharing can be a model, can be a mechanism for raising innovative finances. Innovative finances not only to make the system work, but also innovative finances to ensure that there is adequate focus on conservation and sustainable use and management of genetic resources, as well as encouraging people to use the bioresources. There is no point in a country saying that it's a mega biodiverse country and essentially close the doors for people to use their genetic resources through a brilliantly done ABS framework, because the entire purpose of ABS is defeated, because ABS, when it was discussed pre-1992 or post-1992, was supposed to be a facilitated mechanism for people to access and use biological or genetic resources for commercial profit making and sharing the costs or the profits with the communities. So what are the alternates in that kind of a situation? First, we need to have a very clear idea in mind that are we putting together a restrictive ABS regime or a facilitative ABS regime? But people should not get a wrong impression that facilitative ABS regime means a free-for-all approach. No. A facilitative ABS regime will have all the checks and balances required under the Nagoya Protocol, but it will have much more facilitational options for people, for stakeholders, for researchers, for private companies and others to come and make use of the genetic resources for value addition, for research and development, for product development and making the profits. Because the more they happen, the more the revenues or benefits that will come into the benefit sharing component. And that's why the second point says the more the users, the more the R&D, the more the revenues, and also ease of compliance. Because if you have a restrictive regime, compliance becomes more difficult. But a facilitative regime, compliance becomes easy. And secondly, and thirdly, and most importantly, we should move away from looking at the entire ABS framework targeting a small number of people who are potentially misappropriate the resources. But we should shift away from that attitude to addressing how do we get a large number of those who wish to comply on board to deal with ABS. Currently, the mindset of people who are working on developing the frameworks, especially the legal frameworks, is that by whatever means let the ABS framework stop people from misusing. It's a very, very correct approach given certain national circumstances. But if we take that as the only approach, we are losing out on a larger number of people who are currently using, who are currently accessing the resources. They are commercializing these resources, but because we have not interpreted the way they would comply or the way they can be brought on board with ABS, we actually are potentially losing out in reaching out to a larger number of groups of people who actually are commercializing bioresources or genetic resources. And I'll give you one or two specific examples in the next couple of slides. So what do we need? We need to incentivize ABS. And how do you incentivize ABS? We have to prioritize modest but steady revenues from ABS over a general perception that ABS and benefits are about multi-million-dollar drug discoveries and having multinational companies participate in sharing the benefit. So the infrequent big payoffs should not be seen as a compromise for modest but steady revenues from ABS. And once we have that basic understanding, we ourselves will know how to make it facilitation. So we want larger players to comply. We need steady revenues to come, but we need to ensure that the ABS frameworks are modest enough that they can be adopted, they can be changed over a period of time, rather than setting some of these principles in stone. The second one is that we have to prioritize cooperation over competition. Countries, especially in regions or sub-regions, understand and know that a large number of genetic resources are shared among countries. So it's going to be very soon an option for those who are trying to access the resources to go to countries that have relatively better facilitational mechanisms for prospecting than to go for countries who have got brilliantly done legal frameworks which are very protectionist. So essentially the idea is that how do we work on cooperation rather than competition in terms of sharing the resources and also the associated traditional knowledge. And lastly and importantly, there is a big focus on penalizing those who actually misappropriate than incentivizing those who would like to comply. So it is very important that as and when we are developing policies on ABS or legal measures on ABS, we have to have a perfect balance where we have to stop people from misappropriating, but encourage people who want to use it and who want to comply to actually have a better resources at the national level. But how do we make it work? Those are the 3 bullet points I've just put. 1, the monetary and non-monetary benefits from ABS must significantly exceed the costs of setting up and implementing an ABS regulatory framework. If we do not get these numbers correct now, we will have dozens of countries who will have a brilliant ABS framework, but hardly any revenues or any non-monetary benefits coming out of an ABS framework. But at the end of the day, the implementation becomes a huge state burden because countries are going to establish institutions, countries are going to be investing in putting the framework into operation. So certainly the cost-benefit analysis is not going to be tuned towards a positive mark. The second point is that we have to have innovative models for benefit sharing. But when I say innovative models, not all models would work for all the countries. So countries have to adapt, countries have to be innovative in terms of looking at several different models and use their capacities to prioritize according to the national requirements. And this is where we should slightly move away from our traditional way of looking at ABS from the way we negotiated the protocol to the way we want to implement the protocol. As I said, the negotiations were not focused on conservation and sustainable use to a large extent. It was more on administrative and legal provisions. Implementation, we have to focus on conservation and sustainable use. And lastly, ABS must necessarily lead to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity through an effective combination of rights and incentives. If an ABS policy or a framework is not going to be recognizing the balancing needs of rights and incentives of both people who have the resources as well as people who are going to be using the resources, we'll have a very well-written legal framework, but very difficult to implement because the rights are relatively not known and the incentives are going to be minimal for those who want to prospect or who want to use these resources. I'm not going to get into any detail of this particular slide where I've just projected 3 points. Of course, there are publications available in terms of how to make these work. I can share it with you, or if you have any questions I can answer, because each one of them would require a full webinar in its own merit. And of course, we have had a webinar about 2 weeks ago on ABS and biotrade. And for those of you who have joined us would know some of those details. But certainly, one potential area where countries seem to be missing out that are developing the ABS framework, where the discussions on ABS is done independent of those who manage the protected areas in countries, is even today the mindset to a large extent is protected areas are no-go zones. Nobody should go and prospect, nobody should go and do any research, and generally it is a tendency. I'm not saying all the countries have this problem or an issue, but to a large extent countries have this issue. But if I am going to be a prospector, if I'm going to be a researcher, that where my interest or what I'm looking for is a unique biodiversity or unique genetic resource with the property, the storehouse of those resources are protected areas. And a large number of patents, a large number of royalties that are accrued using bioresources, if you have an analytical view of that, you can recognize that a large number of them can actually come from protected areas. Whether it is Yellowstone National Park or whether it is other areas in the world, protected areas have historically provided very unique germplasm for prospecting, research and development and for products. So countries need to ensure that as and when they are developing these frameworks, their protected area management systems, protected area management plans, discussions with their protected area managers have to be appropriate, so that they don't say that protected area is a no-go zone, which means actually stopping people from accessing a unique set of biodiversity that is there. But of course, it does not mean that people will get into those protected areas and take away all the biodiversity. But at least for research and development purposes, it gives them a lot of clues in terms of product development. And of course, ABS and community enterprise. And again, as I said, that it will require a full webinar to get into explanation. But I've asked Diego, the organizer of this webinar, to put one document online as a background resource to this particular webinar, where we have analyzed on how the communities already are working on ABS principles, using ABS guidelines, and have already put in place a lot of workable mechanisms on the ground. But for various reasons, we have not looked at analyzing them, and we so far have ignored a lot of that experience when it comes to ABS implementation. My request for those of you who are attending this webinar is to actually look at how the community already have set some principles of ABS, but not defined in terms of the wording that we use in the Nagoya Protocol, perhaps. So I'm just going to give you one or two very specific examples of this financing mechanism. And one example comes from India, which is based on an access fee model. And the second one is to focus on some benefit sharing options through the community perspectives. Let me just stop at this particular slide before I jump to give you a bit of a background to the access fee model. India has what is called the Biological Diversity Act that was passed in the year 2002. And the rules were notified in 2004. And India perhaps is one of the few countries who have had a lot of experience, both positive and negative, in terms of implementing ABS frameworks. And I always say that India is one of the few countries who have got more than 100 ABS agreements that are put in place, and perhaps India is one country which had put the internationally recognized certificate of compliance online as the first country to do it. Having said that, one of the opportunities that is provided in the access and benefit sharing provisions in India is that the communities are empowered through the legislation to actually charge access fee, a levy on genetic resources as and when they are able to provide access to people who want to use the bioresources. But so far, there has been no discussion on how to make that particular part of the legislation work. And there has been very limited discussion in terms of how bioresources or genetic resources are being accessed in India, on what could be the kind of benefits that could be accrued. So I had an opportunity to serve as the chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority, where my intention was to explore these mechanisms to make or to see whether this access fee model could be operational. And to make it work, different discussions were held with different sectors: biotechnology sector, seed industry, pharmaceutical industry, the local traditional health or medical manufacturing industry. In India, we have an association which is called the Ayurvedic Drug Manufacturers Association. The ADMA that you see on the screen stands for that. The ADMA is Ayurvedic Drug Manufacturers Association, which actually is an association of more than 120 companies whose main work is to develop herbal formulations or local Indian traditional medical drugs in terms of use for treatments of various diseases. So when we started discussing with them on saying that how each of this sector would come on board to deal with ABS provisions, the first reaction from the sectors were relatively negative to the extent they said that it's another fee that we have to pay. We already have so many other taxes and levies that we have to pay because of the business that we do. So on top of it, if there is going to be another thing to be done for benefit sharing, it's going to be really reducing our profits. It's not going to be working for us. So there's been a lot of resistance for these industry groups to come on board to comply with the provisions of access and benefit sharing. And of course, one option is for them to say that you have a law and you will be penalized, it will be criminal offense to use and all that. But then we thought that let's discuss with them in terms of what could be the appropriate way of bringing them on board, where none of the industry people refuse to abide by the principle of equity and benefit sharing. There is nobody is refusing that they will share benefits. But the nature of the benefit sharing, the percentage of benefit sharing, the complexity involved in arriving at a benefit sharing figure, those are the things which everybody was really worried in terms of how to make it work. And as a regulator, the difficulty for the authority was that in a country of that big size with hundreds and hundreds of industries operating in different sectors, it is very difficult for us to know on who is accessing what for what purpose. And secondly, a lot of these activities are already ongoing for the last several decades. We are talking of some of these companies which are 100 or 150 years old. So the difficulty is how to take them on board. So one option is to say that there is a law and you will be penalized. The other option is that there is a law, but then let us discuss on what is the best facilitational way we can bring you on board with respect to this. So one of the discussions that we have had with this particular group, which I'm presenting as a kind of an example for a model, there are quite a few models that are available for you. If you have any questions, I can answer them later. We actually had developed a bit of a kind of a grid, and I hope that you can see the grid fairly well. There we have the grid which goes from the applicability and the quantum of resources that are required for developing a product, which actually starts from the green boxes that goes up on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we have got the products that are developed by these particular companies, where the value of these products actually keep increasing. So in other words, if you take the bottommost box, which is x and y axis, it actually says traditional artifacts, non-edible oils, agricultural bioresources and food, essential oils. So all of these are considered as large quantities are required, but the value of these products are relatively low. So we started mapping on what kind of bioresources are used by this particular group of people, and we went up to the ones which are the orange or the red on the screens at the top, which looks at commercial R&D, biopharmaceutical sector, traditional knowledge, genetic resource for agricultural biotechnology and all, where the applicability or the quantum of ABS is going to be high, but the value addition or the availability of these resources will also be high. So essentially, we just wanted to do a grid in terms of what is the applicability of quantum for ABS. If you're going to talk of timber, plywood, furniture and all, there is hardly any ABS because most of it are large volume products but doesn't work on ABS principles, or there is nothing which is going to be binding them. To a commercial R&D or biopharmaceutical sector where it looks at developing a big biotechnological product, to agriculture, biotechnology, genetic engineering and things like that, where the volume is going to be relatively high. So based on this, we actually had discussed with these 120 companies in terms of understanding how do they use these genetic resources. Because, mind you, most of these are commercial uses. So these are commercial uses of genetic resources or biological resources. So the discussion we had actually ended up getting a lot of good information in terms of how the companies are using different bioresources for value addition. One, if you look at the table that is there, you have formulations that have up to 10 different bioresources that are used, or genetic resources that are used. 60% of them in solids, 26 in semi-solids, 28 in liquids, and you have the details which are on the screen. But what we realized from this particular table was that few species, few genetic resources are used as main ingredients, and rest are used as subsidiary ingredients. So in other words, we are not looking at the value of these genetic resources for product development, which is going to be the same across all the species. So there has to be a differential between species which are used in high volume, low value, and species which are high value, low volume. And secondly, a majority of these species are not collected from one particular geographic area. They're collected from different geographical areas. So which means that if there is going to be a prospecting application coming to your country, definitely there are opportunities or possibilities that the same prospecting application may go to another country where you have a different geoclimatic zone. So which means that for the company, they may be addressing two different countries in terms of ABS compliance, but for them it is just one product that is going to be developed. And if that is going to be the situation, what is going to be the pressure on the entrepreneur? What is going to be the industry trying to do? One, on an average, for example, in India, 250 species are required in terms of high volume requirement for developing traditional medicine. And because of the nature of this particular industry, the companies have to produce close to 150 different formulations because the prescriptions that are going to go with them are going to be too high. Without getting into the details of it, what it actually provides is that when you are looking at commercial use of genetic resources for product development, for example, like the traditional medicine industry, it has got a very special requirement, and it has also got a very special way of looking at accessing the resource and also using the resource. And this is just one example. There is one species which is called Andrographis paniculata. And this is used in different formulations. This particular genetic resource or species is used in different formulations. And you can look at the percentage of this particular species used in different products. So for example, if I'm going to be developing what is called the Himalayan Vatisa, which is a commercial drug or a prescription medicine in traditional medicine, and I am going to be discussing an access and benefit sharing formula for benefit sharing, and if I'm going to tell you have to give 1% of the profit or 2% of the profit you're making on that particular drug, it is quite imbalanced in terms of the access and the use of the volume of that species than the last row that says Andrographis paniculata extract, where 98 to 100% of the product is used, of this genetic resources used in the product development. So unless ABS framework developers understand the specificity, having a blanket percentage of 2%, 3%, 5% of the profits is going to be challenged, and in many instances countries may find it very difficult to negotiate benefit sharing agreements and to implement the benefit sharing provisions. We have to have a differential approach case by case in terms of the volume or the value of these resources that are going to be used. And of course, I don't expect you to read this particular table. This is just to give you an example of how that one particular product, the Himalayan Vatisa that I mentioned, uses 50 different bioresources to make one product. So if you go by a traditional way of looking at access and benefit sharing, where benefits have to be shared on each genetic resource accessed, essentially we are blocking off about 50 times of differential way of interpreting the benefit sharing because 50 species are used. And that is why in India what we did was that we thought, let us do the benefit sharing component on the product and not on the individual components of how many species are being used. So what we did was that with the industry, there was a mapping that was done in terms of how many of these species are used in large volumes and how many of these species are used in smaller volumes? How many of these species are very commonly occurring species? And how many of them are endemic, rare species, but still required for the drug manufacturing? And we also looked at what is the kind of resource that is used. Is it the fruit? Is it the leaf? Is it the bark? Because each one of them have a different implication on the conservation part of it. If you have a species where the bark is used, definitely it is affecting the species, because once you remove the bark, the species or the particular plant or the tree is going to be exposed for a lot more of stress. But if you're using leaves, if you're using fruit, and if you're using flowers, absolutely no problem. A lot of volumes can be used. So based on this, we did actually this quadrant, where if you take the box Q1, these are actually sustainably harvested species, but very easy to collect because these species are available in large quantities and they're also used in large volumes. So this mapping was done as Q2, where the sustainability is an issue because some of them are endemic and some of them we have to use the stem, the wood, which means that it is to a certain extent a destructive harvesting. However, there is no difficulty in collecting because a lot of these species are available everywhere. Q3, there is some difficulty in collection, but then the sustainability is not a problem because a lot of these are available in large volumes. But when it comes to Q4, which is on the top quadrant, that is where the issues become difficult because these are species which are not available in plenty. So they are difficult to collect, they are endemic, and we have issues of sustainability also. So what we did using this particular thing was that we actually mapped out this kind of a grid where we asked the manufacturing industry who are accessing these resources, who are prospecting these resources, to actually come up with a kind of a dollar value. Of course, the numbers there are in rupees because it was done in India, but the mapping was done as species that are available in plenty, but there is no resource management issue, that therefore, but they are used in large volumes by the industry. The kind of access fee that was put in place was relatively minimal. We are talking of 1,500 Indian rupees, which approximately comes to about $25. And when we map these in terms of the availability and the use, availability and the volume of use, if you go to the last top column, which says heartwood, the pink one, it actually has the highest amount of access fee because it is rather destructive in terms of collection, but it's still needed for the manufacturing industry, but they are also not available in plenty. So there we said the access fee has to be something like about $120. So the mapping actually was done like this for close to 190 species that are used currently by the manufacturing industry. And the premise of this entire thing is to come up with a kind of a benefit sharing model based on access to the resources. I can recognize that some of you may have a question to say that are we talking of access only, because the Nagoya Protocol talks of access and benefit sharing. But my experience of working in India as well as in other countries and looking at some of these issues more closely on the ground, the preference is always to distinguish between access and benefit sharing. Mind you, the access fee based benefit sharing principle is something which actually is going to be simple. It is going to be sustainable because this industry people are going to be using these resources every year, year after year. So which means that whatever revenue you can collect by using access fee as an example is going to be a consistent, predictable flow of finances that will come into the conservation fund established as a part of the national ABS framework. This is not as unpredictable as the ABS frameworks we talk about, where we give permission for somebody to prospect a resource not knowing the result, not knowing how long it will take for the prospectors to come up with the product, not knowing the market potential of this product 5 years or 10 years or 15 years down the line. This is something which is predictable, this is something which is simple, and this is something which can be done easily at the national level. So what we've done is that, of course, at the national level, we could not move this idea forward because The focal point ministry was a little reluctant to move it. But in India, we also have what we call as the provincial level access and benefit sharing mechanisms for implementation. So this model has been picked up by the provincial or the state biodiversity boards. And currently we have more than 4 or 5 state biodiversity boards who are actually using this model to generate revenues, to generate incentives for conservation and sustainable use and management of bioresources using the principle of access fee, which is included as a part of the ABS mechanism. And of course, this is still to be tried at the local level, because at the local level, unless we build enough awareness and capacities on how they can negotiate and how they can deal with the access fee requirements and the models, there is actually a danger that we will raise the expectation, but they being unable to implement some of them unless the awareness and the capacities of communities are adequately built. So what are the advantages of this particular model? One, the industry, where we have hundreds of enterprises using the resources for commercialization, they come on board to comply, because this entire matrix was something which was developed by them as their agreed contribution to the National ABS Fund in terms of providing access. The second one, by doing that, with no cost to the regulator or no cost to the institution which is responsible for implementing the ABS provision, you will know the nature of the resource that is being used, the volume of the resource being used, and the specifics of the resource that is being used. Because the quantums of access fee that you are going to collect as a regulator, as an institution working on ABS, responsible for ABS, is based on all of those 3 things: the nature of the species, the volume, how much it is being used, and what is it being used for. So in one stroke, with zero investment, you actually are developing a full inventory at the national level in terms of knowing who is using what species for that particular sector. Even though I gave you an example of the traditional drug manufacturing sector in India, you can extrapolate the same kind of a model or an example across different sectors. You can do it for biotechnology, you can do it for agriculture, you can do it for cosmetics, you can do it for nutraceuticals. The third point is that once you set the access fee, which is you begin with, because it has to be a kind of a win-win fair approach to ensure that these people comply with the provisions of ABS, but because of the nature of these revenues into the fund, the regulator will have an opportunity to negotiate the access fee over a period of time again and again. So which means that this year I may charge $10 for a resource, 3 years down the line, I can increase it to $12 or $15. So which means that it is like a business model that works on the demand and the supply. And the third part of it, which is very, very important, is that you are actually using the benefit sharing fund the way you want in terms of defining your benefit sharing fund management procedures or rules that you're going to set. But one of the things that we agreed with this particular sector, as and when we discussed this idea, was that when the funds that are accrued because of this particular activity are going to be used, it will be managed by a small team of experts, where we will also have the representative of that particular industry to come on board. And the idea behind that is that they will have a bit of a confidence on how their resources are being used. Secondly, they can also tell you on what are the priority species in terms of the prospecting potential that either they have or they do not have. So in other words, countries would have an opportunity to start focusing on conservation, sustainable management of species, much more focused than having a kind of a random hit and miss approach of conservation effort on the ground when it comes to endangered species, when it comes to endemic species and things like that. So that way it's a win-win, because you can also negotiate with the industry for a buyback arrangement for some of these species at a preferential rate that you can negotiate later. So if that is going to be one model which currently is working at the provincial or state level in India, what are the other options that are available for using ABS as a financing mechanism? Community-led enterprises. There is no one country globally that actually does not have some form of community-led enterprise using genetic resources. But so far, our focus on the entire aspect of work related to community-based enterprise development using natural resources has been only in terms of providing a small value addition, getting the costs of it correct, linking it up with the markets kind of a thing. But we never had looked at it from an ABS perspective. Again, this may require a full webinar to get into the details of it, but that's an opportunity which countries can use to make use of ABS as a financing mechanism. The second point, trade in bioresources. A lot of us spend a lot of time discussing illegal trade. But research has shown that legal trade in bioresources is something which countries are missing out all the time. Countries are trading in bioresources as commodities in thousands and thousands of metric tons. And to a large extent, the value of these resources that are exported under the trade umbrella or under the trade route, there is very limited focus in terms of either conservation of those species nor putting the right value of those species, where you can possibly look at having a small additional value in terms of the trade that can come back as resources into the benefit sharing fund. Currently, there is absolutely almost no discussion that happens with Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Environment, who are the focal points for ABS, in terms of making the Ministries of Trade understand that the resources or the ABS as a principle is that you are free to provide access through exports to whoever you want, but our preference is to have a small additional fee in terms of providing that access that can come back as benefits for the country to flow in for conservation and sustainable use. And the third point is that we have a large number of sectoral industries who currently are completely unaware of in terms of their ABS responsibilities. A lot is being written about it. We have had brilliant publications in terms of some of these approaches or some of these opportunities, but we have seen very little results of these sectoral industries. And the approach that we've taken, like the one of the traditional drug manufacturing industry, if it can be applied to other sectors as well, depending on the nature of the industry, the nature of the resource use, and the profitability of each of these industry or sectors, definitely we'll have a much larger opportunity or window in terms of moving forward the ABS things. And a lot of these principles, even though we are discussing as if it's discussed in Nagoya or 10 years before that or now through the national frameworks, talk to community representatives and they'll give you brilliant expositions in terms of prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms and benefit sharing from their own perspectives. And this publication is a little dated because it's 2009 it was published, still holds some relevance in terms of learning from communities, learning from practitioners on how they see benefit sharing perspectives. And this publication provides some very interesting perspectives into enterprising communities and how they see it. And personally for me, this is one approach countries need to actually understand and also mainstream as and when national ABS frameworks are developed. So my concluding remarks, one, when you're doing a national framework on ABS, design a framework that delivers. Delivers for conservation, delivers for sustainable use, and delivers for providing that adequate additional finances through different models. Second, ensure the economics of functional systems make sense. Don't have a brilliantly done legislation and an institution that is unable to raise resources 10 years down the line. It just doesn't make much of a sense. Third, understand ABS is not a standalone requirement, but ABS has been put in place or negotiated as a part of the convention in itself is to support conservation and sustainable use and management. Fourth, please ensure that your legal framework or a policy framework is able to attract a larger number of people to comply rather than a smaller number of people to run away. And lastly, look for innovative options to secure the benefits. There is nothing which is called a right approach or a wrong approach. So far, the principles of access and benefit sharing are honored. So far, the institutional frameworks are available. And so far, you are able to negotiate with the user a fair and equitable way of managing your resource through access fee, through or any other model that I've just mentioned. It's going to be a win for the Nagoya Protocol, both at the global level as well as at the national level. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Pisupati. It's a really interesting topic for our NBSAP forum members, and I am sure our audience enjoyed the presentation. I want to invite our participants to share your questions, doubts, and comments, or raise your hand to participate in the Q&A session that we are starting now. Please use the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. We can open your microphone or read your question depending on the connection and your preference. I'm going to read one question that just come up. Can you please share what ABS mechanisms are available to communities popularly and especially from your experiences in India?
Okay. Quite a few. Essentially, unknowingly or knowingly, several initiatives that are put by the government in terms of supporting community-based natural resource management, which in many countries is as popular as in India. Quite a significant part of the focus of some community-based natural resource management have certain principles and provisions related to ABS that are enshrined as a part of the objectives. For example, in India, there is a program called the Joint Forest Management. And this program actually provides access and rights for communities to manage the forests, but at the same time provides them with an opportunity to make use of the non-timber forest produce that is done as a part of the Joint Forest Management. The revenues that are generated actually are shared with the communities, but the decisions in terms of how much to share and the mechanisms of it is controlled by the government. So that is one example there, some of these mechanisms. But to a large extent, the difficulty that we have is that the moment you talk of an ABS framework, everybody looks at it as if it's a very new framework, it is still to be developed, and unless you agree with all the sort of 40 articles of the Nagoya Protocol, you can't put something in. That's relatively a wrong argument. There is a lot of activity that goes on community-based resource management. There is a lot of activity that goes on value addition by the communities for bioresources or genetic resources. Trade in terms of different approaches. I'm not talking about trade in thousands of metric tons at the national level. Trade that happens all the time in terms of communities trading their resources. But trading is also providing access to those users. But because there is no mechanism for people to understand the principles of it from their own operational perspective, we have difficulties in terms of people trying to understand or operationalize the ABS principles. But so that's at least one example of how things do work. But many times we don't recognize them as ABS.
Thank you very much. We have some hands raised. Just let me open the microphone of Lily Rodriguez. Lily, can you hear us?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, I have two questions. Excellent presentation. It sounds to me like this proposal or approach for Indian states, it's somehow like the biotrade initiative, or could it be part of the biotrade initiative? And the second question is if this access fee provides also access for research, let's say for bioprospecting. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I do not know whether you were there during the last webinar that focused on ABS and biotrade. And that's exactly one of the points we said was that trade, biotrade, and ABS principles. The lines are actually very, very fine. Mm-hmm. Biotrade and ABS, yes, there may be a possibility for people to start interpreting this entire thing as a biotrade principle. But as far as I'm concerned, and this is the same discussion we had with David Weaver, who actually works on biotrade from UNTAN, was that whether it is biotrade or whether it is ABS, end of the day, the principle of it is very simple. When somebody is accessing your resource and making a profit, he or she should share the benefit. Mm-hmm. And that is why we are going to have a special session on the 3rd of December as a part of COP in Cancun, where the focus of that particular session is on biotrade, where we have the first session that focuses on the issue of biotrade and ABS to clarify some of these questions. So it can be interpreted as a principle of biotrade, but the thing is, remember, principle of biotrade is more in terms of taking the resource, looking at the value of it and then giving it to somebody else. But here we are looking at a negotiation. We are looking at an access fee as an entry point for people to start complying with ABS. Giving an access fee by this particular industry is not the end of our ABS negotiation. It's the beginning of an ABS negotiation, because based on the access we have provided, if they are going to be developing new and additional products which have a commercial value and which are going to be marketed where they make a profit, the condition is that they will come back to sign a benefit sharing agreement in its full spirit as per the provisions of the Act and as per the provisions of the Nagoya Protocol. So to a certain extent, yes, definitely there is a fine line between buyer trade and ABS, but it is the way you actually negotiate, it is the way you actually put in place an operational system. Your second question, in terms of access fee, does it actually entail them to do research and development? Yes, because as and when we are discussing a collaboration or an agreement with this particular group, for example, the agreement is only that they are going to be providing a fee for accessing. But providing access or providing a fee for access is not going to preclude them from signing an ABS agreement as and when they do research and development, make a product and commercialize it and get profits. So innately, this particular access fee based agreement would have clauses to say that when research and development is done on the products that they are accessing, which are new and additional, then definitely they have to comply with the provisions of ABS. They have to sign a mutually agreed term and share with the benefits as discussed appropriately at that particular time of product development.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks. We have another hand raised. I'm going to open microphone for Abdul Aziz. Abdul, can you hear us? Abdul? Okay, it seems like we have some problems with the audio. While we try to fix it, I'm going to read another question from our participants. Unregulated markets for herbs and species do a lot of business in developing countries and often go unchecked. How can we regulate them and bring them under the umbrella of ABS tools like access fees or any other system?
The example that I gave basically is a model of bringing some of these industries under the umbrella of ABS. Because when we negotiated this particular access fee model, as I told you, one of the things that we are doing is that the access fee is decided on the nature of the resource, the volume of the resource, and the species that are going to be using. So in other words, by having this model in place, you already know who is using what, for what purpose, and in how much quantity. So that in itself actually brings some of these industries, some of these sectors to comply with the provisions of ABS, and they will, in one way or another, going to be providing you a full set of information which you otherwise will not be able to get at national level. Because there is no way, for example, in India, you can go and collect how many species are being traded for traditional drug manufacturing, how many species are being used, and who is going to be selling it, what is the volume, because it's such a huge country with so much of unorganized market that is there. But working through the industry, you basically will know some of these numbers. A lot of people may raise a question saying that, but are the numbers correct? But when you're beginning this discussion, I'm not worried about are the numbers correct, because at least we have got numbers to begin with. Currently, without that particular framework, you have nothing. At least now, for example, under this model, I have 120 industries who are going to tell me where are they getting it from, what species is being gotten, and in how much volumes. So at least I've got that many number of people who will come on board to comply with the ABS provisions. Because as I said, that the access fee is not going to let them off the hook from doing an ABS agreement. So in other words, I'm actually bringing a larger number of people into my compliance net by having this kind of an approach.
Thank you very much. Just want to remind you that you can send the question through the questions tab in the GoToWebinar platform, or raise your hand also from the control panel of the GoToWebinar. Abdul Aziz, can you hear us? Hello? Well, the rise is in the hand is raised, but it seems like we have some problems with the audio. No, I cannot connect. Sorry. Can you send us the question through the questions tab, please, Abdul, so we can just read it? Hello? Hello? No, it seems like we have some problems. Okay, just send us your question. I do not have more questions or hands raised at this point. Not sure if Dr. Bala wants to implement or to include other thoughts around the topic.
Nothing specific at this point, but for those of the colleagues who are joining us, if we are going to be in Cancun at the COP 2, certainly we have an opportunity to discuss further. But if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the email address and send, please. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, it seems like we don't have. Okay, Abdul could send us the question. As you know, some people live inside and some people in buffer area. What is the base mechanism for benefit sharing?
Can you repeat the question, Diego? Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to read it. As you know, some people live inside and some people in buffer area. I guess from protected areas. What is the base mechanism from benefit sharing?
Okay, see, when it comes to benefit sharing, the very simple principle is that whoever provides access will have to get the benefit, irrespective of whether they live in the core area or whether they are living in the buffer zone of a protected area. So there is no question of there is going to be a differential arrangement for people living in core area to get certain percentage of benefit, or people who are living in the buffer zone getting a different percentage of profit. It's essentially the people who provide the access are the ones who are going to receive the benefits.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. I do not have more questions or hands raised, so thank you very much, Dr. Bala, for your time, and thank you all for your participation in this webinar. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you and good luck. Thank you. Thank you, Diego.
No, thank you, Dr. Bala. Please check out our website, NBSAPforum.net, to get the list of the resources provided by this webinar. We also can get a PDF copy of the presentation, and you can get the recording link of this presentation as well. Stay tuned for our next webinar, next 17th of November at 9 a.m. New York time, Whistleblowers on Illegal Wildlife Trade, presented by Stephen Cohn from the U.S. National Whistleblower Center. Remember, register or update your profile in the NBSAP forum. Send us your thoughts on webinars topics you would like to discuss in a future session. I am Diego Ochoa from the NBSAP forum. Feel free to send us your comments, suggestions, recommendations. And I hope you all enjoyed these sessions. Please have a nice day, afternoon, or night, and see you in the next webinar. Dr. Bala, again, thank you very much, and I hope to have you here in future webinars.
Thank you very much. Thank you.